Welcome back. This is part 3 of the SVG to Geometry Nodes tutorial series. In part 1, we learned how to take an SVG into Blender and manipulate it with geometry nodes to turn the 2D shape into a 3D mesh and have some control over the topology. In part 2, we learned how to emboss and engrave that 3D shape into another mesh with a random surface, as you can see here. And in this part, I want to extend this and build upon this and look at how we can emboss or engrave this logo on a bent surface, like a cylindrical shape, maybe like a bottle or something. And so let's jump into that. And if this becomes too long, I will split it into another part where part 3 will be bending the logo in a cylindrical way, and then the next part 4, will be actually embossing, engraving it onto a cylindrical object. So this is where we left off in part 2, and since we kind of use this cube-ish model that's looking very randomly, we don't really need this. So what I want to start with is take this logo and bend it. So let's reset. Actually, before I do that, I want to make sure I turn off Boolean, because that can slow things down a lot. And so yeah, now I can freely move this around without too much lag. So let's hide this. Actually, there's a better trick, and we can turn on Boolean, and that will, we can see how that works. So this takes a few seconds to calculate, because if you remember from the last part, we used the fancy Boolean way that took longer but was more accurate. So as you can see, it cuts out the logo. But I want to turn on another option for the restriction toggles, which is called disable in viewports. And if you don't know this little eye icon will only hide the object, but we will still calculate all the Boolean stuff. So if we hide this cube and then we move this logo object around, it will recalculate on every frame. If you animate this, it will have to recalculate this Boolean operation, which takes a few seconds. But if we turn off this object in the viewport completely, disable in viewport, then it will not do any of that. So I can show you this. If I take this logo and I just drag it around and then let it go, it's gonna just freeze up Blender, because even though we don't see the cube, it's hidden, it will still calculate this. And it's still calculating. Okay. So yeah, that's not useful. Instead of this hiding, we can disable it in viewport. Also hides it, but it doesn't. Now I can grab this and I can just move it around. That's the difference between the hiding and disabling in viewport. This actually disables anything that has to do with calculating or anything with this object. So now I can take my logo and reset the location, reset the rotation, and reset the scale, so we are back to a good starting point. And what I want to be able to do is bend this logo around a cylindrical shape. So if we are in this orientation, what I kind of want to do is look at it from the front like this, and then I want to turn this into a kind of a circular shape like this. Maybe I can draw on the screen a little bit. So let's say we have a center point, say here. Then I just want to move this logo on a circle that looks kind of like this. So instead of this point sitting here, it will become somewhere here. So this point moves there, and every point moves along like that. So let's just start by using geometry nodes. Jump into the geometry nodes view, and I can look at the same view, and we still have this drawing. And let's just create a new geometry nodes. Okay, before I go into that, let's take the cube. We were working in geometry nodes at the cube object. Let's say we have like a bottle and I want to engrave that. That engraving step will be part of the bottle's geometry nodes trees. However, the bending the logo, for me, that feels more like manipulating the logo. So I want to add that to the logo. So that's why I'm only looking at the logo now. I'm going to create a new geometry nodes tree. It's also useful to just start from a new tree to keep things organized. So let's start a new geometry nodes tree, and we can rename this to I'm gonna do two things in this geometry nodes tree, which might not be. Actually, we can split it. First, I want to add something that turns the logo, the curve, into a mesh. So let's call this curve to mesh. And I don't know if I remember correctly, but path to 3D. Maybe that's already. Okay. This is also solidifying it. Maybe I want to. Yeah, actually, I want to take this. I want to call this. Is it a path or a curve? What is it? What is the official name? Curve. Okay, curve to mesh. Let's call it curve to mesh. And I don't want to solidify this. And since we already grouped this into a single node, we can always come back and add this in later, but I'm gonna just remove this. And yeah, I wanna have a curve to mesh. So now we turn this curve into a mesh. And the reason why I want to do this, I could just bend the curve, right? But the moment you turn a curve into a mesh, it projects the curve back onto a flat plane. So if we go through the trouble of bending our curves, we lose all of that the moment we turn it into a mesh. That's why I first want to turn it into a mesh and then bend it. Then bend the mesh instead of bending the curve. That's the whole reason for that. Actually, I want to make sure this is protected by hitting this little shield. Now it's protected. Now it will never be deleted, even though it has 2 users. If I remove this, I only have 1 user. And so, all right. Now we have a simple curve to mesh, and we still have control over everything. Maybe we want to expose the resolution there, and yeah, that would be good. So let's look at this resolution. I think 2 is fine for now. And then I want to add another modifier, geometry nodes, and I want to create a new one. And this is gonna be bend cylinder. Something like that. I might come up with a better name, but we want to bend this mesh as this drawing shows. So what do we have to do for that? We have to set the position of every single point of our mesh to a different position on this cylinder. And this is as if you're looking at the cylinder from the front. So how are we going to do this? Well, first of all, we need to set position, and then we take the position and we put in a position. And now in this connection here, this noodle between these 2 nodes, we have to do some math to calculate the new positions, because these are the original positions. So to calculate, let's calculate the new Z position of all of these points. this is the current Z position, it's 0. And the new one will become kind of like lowered down, and it is pretty much based on the X location. Another way to put it is, if you look at this length here is the radius, let's call it R. And this is also R, the length of this. But then here we have an angle alpha. If we have this position, this angle, and this length, we can calculate this point. And we have to use sine and cosine for that. And so R, we can assume, let's just keep it simple and say R is equal to 1. If R is equal to 1, this circle has a really nice property that the amount you want to walk over the circle, so that's the starting with the X value, is the same as the angle in radians. So we don't need to do anything. We just take that X position and plug it into sine and cosine to find the new coordinates of this spot. And I'll just show you how that works. So first we have to split separate XYZ. Separate XYZ and then combine it. And we have to connect all of them. And if you do that correctly, it doesn't change anything if you connect this up. Now we take the original position, separate it, combine it back, and set the position with that. And it just stays the same. Doesn't do anything. But now we can set the new X position. Let's start with the Z position. So the Z position is only based on the X, and it will be the cosine of X. And that will also move it up, but let's just see what that looks like. And the cosine can be found in a math node, simply a value math node. So let's take X. We don't want to change anything about X. We take X, we take the cosine, and we plug that into Z. And that looks something like this, kind of weird, kind of like a sine wave shape. Combine that with moving the X closer, because we're not only moving this point down, we're also moving it a bit closer, because this is not, yeah, it kind of moves in a little bit. So in order to do that, we take the sine, and that will be our new X location. So we take the sine, and now you can see our logo is kind of starting to shape around a cylinder. It's kind of shaped in a circle, if you look at it from the front. And that's kind of the shape that we have here, but it's moved up, and we consider the origin as the center now, because we're just taking a very simple sine and cosine. But we're already getting somewhere. So let's look at the next step, which will be customizing the radius, because right now the radius is 1. This is exactly 1 Blender unit, or 1 meter in Blender. Let's take a constant input value. Constant value. Let's rename this to radius. And instead of 1, set it to 2. See what happens. That will make it a little bit less curvy. So one of the things we always do with sine and cosine is multiply with the radius, whatever the radius is. So let's do that. So let's take this, duplicate it, turn it into a multiply node. And I want to plug it in over here as well as over here. Now we're multiplying with 0.5, which makes it smaller. But if we multiply with our radius set to 2, it makes it bigger. And that is what it looks like. It's a little bit stretched. And instead of moving all the way around, we want to reduce that angle. And we want to reduce the angle by dividing by 2. Because if the radius was 1, our X maps exactly to the alpha angle in radians. if we double the radius, the angle will be half as big. That might be an intuitive way to see it. So instead of directly plugging the x into sine and cosine, we have to take x divided by our radius, which is 2. X divided by 2 just makes it half as big. And instead of that, it will make the logo move from here to somewhere here, like halfway what it is doing now. So let's duplicate the multiply node, change it to a divide node. And we don't have to divide twice because we can just take the x and plug it in here, take the radius, plug it in here, and then plug that result both back into sine and cosine. And now the proportions of the logo are correct, and we have a radius of 2. But we're also moving up by 2. But now we can play with the radius, and you can see the smaller the radius, the more it bends around, and the closer it gets to the origin, and the bigger the radius, the less curvy it becomes. And now it's almost back to a flat logo with a large radius. Let's set it back to 2. The thing I want to do is make it bend like this and make it stay stuck to our origin, which just makes it easier to control. That's the only reason I want to do that. So the only thing we have to do is move it back down in the Z by 2. So we have to, and 2 is our radius because we're starting at the origin and then going out all the way to the circle. That's the radius. So we just subtract 2 from the Z location with another math node. It's going to be a lot of math nodes today. Subtract, and put that after the multiply. Subtract by 2. Again, the radius, and that moves it down. And now I have some really nice control. If we change the radius to something smaller, we bend more. If we increase the radius, we bend less. And this is already a really nice control. And you might think that these X, Y, and Z values prevent you from rotating this object, because then the math doesn't work out anymore. And you would be correct if this is global X, Y, and Z. But these positions and X, Y, and Z values are all local to the object. So we could come in and rotate this object around however we like. We even scale it, and it all works. And we can still change the radius, and everything works. And that's already really nice to have. So let's reset the location, scale, and position. And this could already be a really nice node group to have, to just bend your objects around based on a radius. So maybe I can duplicate this group input and expose this radius. So let's make that a value and plug that in like this. Now we can get rid of this radius. And this input should be set to 1, I guess, by default. And we can make this a little bit nicer, call it radius. And the subtype is a distance. The min should be 0 because you shouldn't be able to go below 0. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And the default should be something like 1. And now we have a nice bend cylinder geometry node group that allows you to take an object and bend it around a cylinder like this. You can do this, have all the control, and then you can move it around. Doesn't matter. We could rotate it 90 degrees around the X. And now we could place this around a bottle, for example. That's really nice. I could leave it at this, but I want to share one more thing, which is having more control over how this object bends by taking another object, say an empty, and making that the center of the bend. So instead of supplying a radius, I want to do it based on a bend center object. So let's rename this to bend cylinder radius. That might be a better way to name this, but this will do for now. And then I'm going to make a copy Or maybe before I do that, I'm going to protect this again with the shield icon. So we just have this in the file saved. Now I'm going to copy it. And instead of calling it bend cylinder radius, I want to call it bend cylinder object. Yeah, again, there might be a better way to name this, but instead of bending it based on a radius, I want to bend it around an object where the control object is the center of the circle. And that's a little bit more complicated, but we can just expand on this. Let's reset the rotation again. So let's look at it from the front, and I'm just going to add an empty. And I think a sphere works. It's a little bit big, so let's maybe make it 0.1. And this only affects the display size, so that doesn't really do anything. Let's move it down around this center point so we can see if it works. And let's call it bend center. Okay, go back to the logo, and I'm going to remove this radius. And remember, this is supposed to be the radius. So now we have to calculate the radius based on how far this object is down. So we need an object info node. Like that. I also want to have another group input node. And I want to remove that radius from this. We still have it in the other one. In this one, we still have it, but in this bend cylinder object, instead of supplying a radius, I want to supply an object. And we can do that right now, the bend center. And I want to rename this to the center object, so we know what it is. And only the location of this object will affect our radius. The rotation and scale doesn't really do anything. So what we're going to take is the location. So we might start with separating X, Y, and Z like we did before with the locations of our mesh. But now we have the single location of our control object. And instead of having a value for the radius, we're going to calculate the radius. And I think I want to set the radius to simply the difference between the Z and the two Z locations between the two objects. And you could argue, what happens if we move this to the right? Are we still using that same distance in only the Z location, or do you want to use this distance? I think I want to stick with Z to keep it simple, and it will allow for some interesting control where you don't only control the radius, but also how the logo rolls around. But yeah, you'll see. So for now, I'm going to use the difference between the Z locations. So just duplicate another math node, set it to subtract, and plug in the Z and subtract the Z of the control object. And that will be plugged into the radius. And there we go. Now we have something, and we can control this radius with this object. But again, the Z doesn't do anything. This could be good enough if you just want to have a straightforward bending motion, but there is something interesting you can do with this, where the X location does something. The Y location doesn't really make any sense, so we're not going to use that, but the X location could do something interesting. So let's go back into the nodes, and we can delete this with Control X so we keep the connections. I kind of want to do the same for X to see what happens. So when we move this control object, I want the angle to kind of rotate. So we could do the same subtract here with X, with the X channel. So take the X location, and subtract the X of the control object. Instead of directly going for the X, we take that new one. And now we can kind of roll our object around, it kind of gives us something interesting. I think we will get into trouble. Yeah, if you move this object around in the Blender scene, we don't really update it. And this might be the behavior you want, but what I want is set this to relative. And now, as I move this logo closer to the control object, I can also reduce the radius, and that's kind of what I want. And as we do this, we kind of rotate. This might be the behavior you want. I kind of want to change this up a little bit more, where the center of the logo will always stay in the center of this object. Right now we kind of lose it if the roll is too extreme. So the way to do that is to go back, and not only do we fix the Z, but we also want to offset the X at the very end. And in the beginning we're subtracting this value from the X, and then later on I want to add it back. And what that does is pretty interesting. So let's take this X value and add it back at the very end, right before we combine it back. And now if you move this in the X direction, you can see it kind of rolls, but the center always stays in the center. And we can move this around, and that kind of works well. And this works in every orientation. You can rotate this around the X axis by 90 degrees, and still works. You can move this up. Right now, moving this into the Z direction doesn't do anything, but we could move it like this. We can move it in the Y direction to control the radius. And that's the control I want. There's one final thing that you can do to make this even better. So let's reset everything, reset the location, scale of both objects. And now the logo disappears because we have a radius of 0 right now. That's why the logo disappears. You can move this down a little bit and you will see the logo. But with the both objects completely reset, I want to take the logo, take the center and parent it to the logo. And that gives us some more interesting control, where now the bend center is parented to the logo. We can move it down so we can see it again. And now, since moving it in the Y direction doesn't do anything, we can lock the Y of our bend center. And now we can only move it in the direction that does something. So you can hit G and it only moves like this. It doesn't move anything in the Y direction. And we might as well also lock the rotation and scale, because we don't really use that. We don't do anything with that. So now we can't scale it because we only use the position. So now we have that. And now if we want to move our logo around, it stays in the same shape. And we could rotate it around the X axis, and our control point moves with the logo, which is useful. So we could move this around, and now if we had a bottle somewhere here, then we could easily control this. And this is kind of, now we see we can move this logo, we can move this control point in the Z direction, but locally that is the Y direction. So when you do that, oh, okay, it locks it. Yeah, so that doesn't really make sense. So instead of global, you can set this to local, and now it makes sense. So now in the local Z direction, as you can see, the Z value here changes when I drag this, and that's because we rotated it. And that gives you a lot of control over placing the logo, but if you want to animate the logo in any way, this also gives you a lot of control over animating how this logo is bending, which might be interesting. And I think that's enough for part 3. If you have any questions, you can always leave them below as usual. And in part 4, we're going to look at taking this and engraving it or embossing this logo onto cylindrical objects like a bottle. So see you in part 4.